Welcome to Table Goth. I am Bully, and this is my review of Hunter the Reckoning 5th Edition. Rather than giving a rating on some sort of scale, I'm going to break this review up into a few sections so you can know what to expect. First, I'm going to be talking about what the game is. Second, I will be discussing the lore of the game. Third, I'll be covering the rules, mechanics a little bit. Fourth, we're going to talk about the layout, design of the book itself. Fifth, I'm going to talk about what storytellers can expect to get from this book. And then sixth, I will cover what the players can expect to get from this book. And then we'll do our final thoughts. So let's jump right in. So first off, what is this game? What is Hunter the Reckoning 5th Edition? I'm going to kick this off and let the book explain the setting itself by reading a passage from it. Humanity clings to a comfortable illusion that the world belongs to mankind, that they lead lives of free-willed individuality, completely unaware that they occupy a world of grim mysteries inhabited by monsters. Those savvy to the secrets of the world of darkness know the truth, however, that timeless blood drinkers, ravening shapeshifters, restless ghosts, and even more harrowing things haunt the night. That is our setting of Hunter the Reckoning. You play as a hunter. A hunter is someone who is aware that the world is full of monsters. They view these monsters as a threat, and they've decided to do something about it. The gameplay is designed to revolve around three parts. The main part is gathering information, gathering intel on what your quarry is and what your quarry wants. Then, once you know this, the idea is to figure out your quarry's weaknesses, develop some tactics, figure out your best plan of attack. And finally, the climax of our hunt is actually engaging with the quarry in a deadly encounter. You will not do this alone. You'll do this with a cell. Think of your cell as your adventuring party, your coterie, your fellow players, the group of hunters that will work together to accomplish things, using their unique talents and expertise to complement each other and help each other progress on their hunt. Hunters do this a wide variety of ways, but one of the main tools a hunter has at their disposal, mechanically, is called edges, and these edges have perks. These are sort of special resources and abilities and talents unique to hunters that make them better at hunting monsters than most mortals. Like all World of Darkness games, this game and setting provides opportunity for a lot of really deep roleplay that's sort of built and assumed into the game. Players are encouraged to explore the obstacles and trauma involved with being a hunter, being aware of this dark world around you, the impossible odds you're up against, and the secret, thankless existence that you now occupy as someone fighting a threat that mostly only you are aware of. As a hunter, a regular life is going to be impossible. So there's a lot of opportunity to explore what that means, what you gave up, what your new life consists of, what happened to make you aware that there's creatures in the night, and exploring what your drive is, why you hunt these monsters, as well as sort of the inter-party dynamics, the tension of working with other people in these life and death scenarios, counting on each other, but also maybe taking comfort in each other as well in an otherwise sort of lonely existence. There's a lot of opportunity for really rich storytelling outside of the tracking, finding, and killing monsters. Because of the focus on roleplay and as well as the actual investigation aspect of it, it makes a lot of different types of characters and archetypes viable. Not just the hunter that's able to deliver that final killing blow, but the hunter that's socially capable and able to gather information by talking to people. Those who are mentally strong and able to put together clues and do research on what they're hunting and how to defeat it. There's a lot of different angles you can take on playing an interesting and also useful hunter. I will warn you that for a game called Hunter the Reckoning, it's not as combat heavy as you might think, or at least it's not designed to be. Again, I say this again, if you watch any of my videos, you know I encourage you to do whatever you want. Take a game, do what you need to do, take some parts, throw in your others. This can, if you want this to be just a combat game, the tools are certainly in this book. There's some great options for that. Um, but that's not what the game is designed to be. Again, they sort of break it up actually into primarily investigation, and then sort of the last piece of the pie they show you is the tracking and killing of your quarry. So keep that in mind. This game is ultimately about the hunt. So it's going to be up to a storyteller to craft a mystery to solve and a very interesting and dangerous antagonist for the cell to go after. Um, in other World of Darkness games that we have so far in 5th edition, like Vampire the Masquerade, there's a big focus on the setting and the machinations of all these NPCs and how the setting changes depending on your actions. In this game, the setting can be different for every hunt, so it's less of a focus on that, and more about the hunt itself and your cell. Let's dive into the lore. So I'm going to be explaining this as if you're not familiar with the World of Darkness. If you're looking at just Hunter, those of you familiar with the World of Darkness and Vampire as a whole will know some of this, but it's important to know it anyway. The World of Darkness is much like our own, which has its advantages in the sort of familiarity and the level of immediate understanding the group is going to have with knowing, okay, we're playing in our world, but where there's monsters and creatures and all these dark things at play that the masses aren't really aware of. You as a hunter, of course, are aware of it. The level that you're aware of it is up to you and your storyteller. You could have just sort of very basic knowledge, and each hunt is an opportunity for you to learn more about the World of Darkness, or maybe you're someone who comes in with quite a bit of knowledge, and it's less about learning what the monsters are rather than using your knowledge to assign, making sure identifying the correct quarry. Either way, the World of Darkness assumes, the setting assumes that every level of society is infiltrated and everyone is potential prey to these creatures. And if left unchecked, humanity is essentially doomed to be at the whims and eventual destruction by the supernatural. Hunters want a reckoning for these creatures. They want to remove the corruption and allow humanity to exist without this added danger. After all, humanity has enough problems without monsters in the night. Most important part about the setting and the lore and the reckoning that the hunters are trying to bring on, the reckoning is now. The reckoning is immediate. The reckoning is something that needs to happen. We cannot wait to fight these monsters. There is an urgency to this problem, and that's where you come in as the players. In the lore, a big part of it is that most people aren't aware of it. There are organizations. Obviously, a lot of the creatures are aware of themselves and other creatures and whatnot. But the idea of this game and what you'll be playing, the capital H Hunter you'll be playing, is more of a solitary existence. It's you and your group. It's sort of you guys as the underdogs against the world, against all these terrible things. And while it kind of seems grim and impossible to actually make a dent in it, all of your characters are driven to still try no matter what. Lore-wise, this desire to do that is called a drive. Each hunter has a drive, this reason for being a hunter, for taking up this quest, and that sort of is built into. There's some mechanics that are built in that, which we'll get into later. But lore-wise, that's what separates a hunter, capital H Hunter, that you'll be playing, and the other mortals who might be in organizations or might be aware that something's out there and they want but they're not the same as you. They don't have that desire to fight the good fight, or at least not fight it for the same reasons as our players and their characters do. In this lore, it lays out some of the different categories of creatures, which we'll get into in the storyteller section, which is really great as far as one of my favorite parts of the book, to be honest. But it also introduces organizations, organized groups that aren't cells. These are bigger than that or have different motivations than that. They don't have that drive to bring along the reckoning to these creatures. That serve as sort of secondary antagonists, which is very interesting. I won't say complete edition. These things have existed, but there's a new focus on it with 5th edition that I think is really interesting at play, because the good versus evil, the hunters versus the monsters, is great. But when you put into play other humans, other mortals, other organizations that are also in the game, but for different reasons, a lot of times those reasons might not work with your cell's reasons. Sometimes they will. So it's interesting when you're willing to work with them, when you're not, when these can be enemies or when they can be resources. There's a lot of gray area that's introduced with these hunter organizations. Otherwise, a lot of the lore is explored and revolves around specific quarry, the specific monsters or creatures or supernatural beings that you'll be encountering. So you learn a lot about the setting and the things that go bump in the night through play, which is really interesting. Something I like about the lore in this is there's a lot less of it than the other World of Darkness splats. For example, like Vampire the Masquerade or Werewolf or Mage. There's a lot to learn if you want to jump in. Of course, you don't have to. I got a whole video on that too about ignoring lore. But if you really want to play the game with everything it has to offer, all the deep history and lore it has to offer, there's a lot. If you're playing Vampire, you got to know the clans. You got to know all these different disciplines and how they interact, all these politics and different sects and traditions and the history, and half of these things are contradictory to each other. There's a lot of built-in lore that comes with being a vampire, for example. But for a hunter, there's a lot less of it, so it's a lot easier to jump in knowing, okay, my character knows monsters are out there. They might not know much, but they know they got to stop them. Let's do it. And you could just sort of jump in without having to memorize all these tomes, which I think makes this game much more accessible. And again, part of the fun of this game is learning the lore through gameplay instead of going in and being like, oh yeah, I know all the vampire clans. You have to learn about this specific vampire you're fighting or you're hunting. Their clan might not even matter in the scheme of your hunt. So it's cool what you'll pick up with the lore in your very specific story-driven way, rather than if I'm playing a vampire in this well-established setting city, I should probably know all this stuff. So that's something to keep in mind. I think that's a positive thing about Hunter the Reckoning. Though a lot of people love World of Darkness because it's so lore heavy. And if you're one of the people who knows all the lore, that lore still exists. That's still happening in this game. Maybe you have reasons where your character knows all the vampire clans and all this stuff. So it's there if you want to use it for your character. But this is one of the more forgiving and canon ways to go in not needing a ton of lore knowledge. And because of that, I can see future Hunter books being more so like scenario books and encounters rather than additional lore books. For Vampire, you have a whole book on the Anarchs, whole book in the Camarilla, whole book Cults of the Blood Gods. You have all these things that just talk about more lore, more settings. There's not really a reason for that in Hunter as much, but this lends itself much more to specific encounters, specific mysteries, specific hunts, which makes me very excited for the future of this specific game. If we're talking about the lore, we should talk about the other editions as well, for those familiar with Hunter the Reckoning from the past. Hunter the Vigil is still is a thing. It's currently being made by Onyx Path. So where does this fall into that? This is Hunter the Reckoning, but those familiar with old Hunter the Reckoning are not going to be familiar with this necessarily. I won't say won't be familiar, but they've stripped away the idea of imbued and divine quests and choosing and all that stuff, and which some people are going to hate. Some people love the idea of the imbued and whatnot. That's not in this game. But if you know anything about branding or just anything about anything, before you complain about these things, just be informed. If you're going to be annoying, be informed and annoying. Your critiques are probably valid, and that's fine, but understand that they didn't want that with this game. And I personally love that decision. I like the idea of being underdogs, about being going up against things that are much more dangerous than me, and having to play smart and investigate weaknesses and use tactics and strategy to take something down, rather than use my divine angel powers that I have. Because that doesn't, again, that has its place. That was great. But I like sort of the grit and the desperation, which we'll get into, of being a hunter in this Reckoning, in 5th edition Reckoning, rather than the old Reckoning. So some people will say, oh, it sounds like this is just more Vigil. It probably is a little closer to Vigil than the old Reckoning. If you know anything about branding, again, Vigil's a thing. So if they can't call this Vigil. That's why it's called the Reckoning, among other reasons I'm sure that I'm not in the know about. But just take it for what it is. If you still want your imbued, put him in this game. That's fine. That's an option. Or just play the other edition. But lore wise, the imbued, a lot of the things that made the old Reckoning the Reckoning are not in this edition. So just know that for players familiar with the old editions going in. This is stripped down from that and more about just mortals and a struggle against supernatural. Next, we'll talk about the rules in this game. Again, if you're familiar with the storyteller system in 5th edition, if you played Vampire, you're pretty much going to know the rules for this. But I'm going to cover the general storyteller system rules for those not familiar, and then we'll get into specific mechanics very briefly. I'll do another video on like actually breaking out how to play the game. But the specific mechanics unique to Hunter. Interesting thing to know is, so this has the same dice mechanics, very similar character sheets, same character creation rules more or less as Vampire, and I assume this will remain consistent across all the 5th edition World of Darkness games. Character creation uses dots or ranks that are allocated to attributes and skills. I'll do a whole video on character creation to break this down, but this is just sort of the basics. Instead of a leveling up system, the storyteller system, which is what Hunter uses, you kind of decide specifically what your character's strengths and weaknesses are. You also choose advantages and flaws to sort of flesh out your backstory and how that mechanically affects your character. Then you choose edges. These are the abilities or tools or resources that make your hunter better at hunting creatures, giving them sort of making them stand out a little bit from your average mortal. These are the closest thing you're going to get to powers in this game, sort of the unique things that you'll pick to make your hunters stand out and what their focus will be on what they add to the cell. I really like the system because you can fine-tune your character. Instead of leveling up, you fine-tune exactly what your strengths and weaknesses are, what you want this character to be able to do, and what their background informs. It's one of my favorite systems, character creation-wise, for this reason. Is if you have an idea, you could put that idea on paper. You don't have to worry about a lot of restrictions for, again, like class or level or whatever. Everything's available to you from the beginning. The more experience you get, the better you'll get at these things, or the more things you'll be able to do. Speaking of experience, you just use your experience points, again, to raise certain attributes, skills, get new perks, edges, things like that. This is different than Vampire in the amount of experience the book suggests. This is a game that, rules-wise, you're intended to level up or get experience faster, because you probably have a much shorter lifespan as a hunter. Hunters are not expected to be hunters for very long. They're eventually probably die on a hunt. So I think the idea of this game is to level up quickly, but potentially face an opponent that you're not ready for, or that gets the best of you, also quicker. This isn't a game where you're playing an immortal who's going to slowly level up because you're alive for a super long time. The idea is to get strong fast and go out in a blaze of glory. Dice mechanics and the storyteller system revolve around dice pools. It's all D10 based, or you can use the unique hunter dice that are available. Essentially, each dot you have in a skill and attribute equals 1 dice you'll roll in your dice pool. This is very easy to pick up. Again, I'll do a video on this, but another thing I really like about the storyteller system is how kind of elegantly simple it is. Mathematically, it's a little wonky because each dice has a 50-50 chance of being a success or failure, but it works, it's fun, and it's easy. Essentially, on each of your D10s, you'll roll a dice. A 6 and up is a success. Below that, it's just not a success. You count up your total successes, and the storyteller will tell you if that's enough successes to do what you're trying to do. They usually set a difficulty. Some mechanics unique to Hunter, for those familiar with this system, are Desperation and Danger, which are new trackers. This is sort of like where Vampire has your humanity tracker and a hunger tracker. These don't really replace them, but they're just new trackers unique to Hunter, which I really, really like, because unlike Vampire, to where these things affect you individually, Desperation and Danger are trackers that the party shares. Each typically go 1 to 5. Desperation represents a sense of urgency in the hunt. As the group makes mistakes or things happen, the desperation level will rise. according to the storyteller. Or it can go down as you succeed on doing things or make things safer or get to points in the story to where you have a little bit of breathing room if you ever get that. So this desperation pool, this tracker 1 to 5, represents how many bonus dice each hunter can use, and everyone has access to this. So if the desperation level is at 3, anytime you're doing something consistent with your drive, which your drive is determined by your creed, which is like your character class, you can say, okay, I'm going to use desperation dice. Desperation levels at 3. I use 3 dice. Again, everyone can use this. The only drawback or risk is if you roll a 1, a critical failure on any of these desperation dice, you will either overreach, which makes the danger level rise, or you can choose to go into despair, which is a sort of a state where you can no longer use desperation dice, but also this kind of roleplay implications to being in the state of despair, and you have specific redemption sort of things you have to do to get out of this state of despair. So there's a lot of cool roleplay built into it, as well as mechanical drawbacks. The danger level is something that the storyteller can choose to share with the group to where everyone knows what the current danger level is, or they can just keep that secret. The danger level essentially represents what it is, how dangerous this hunt has gotten. The book purposely keeps it kind of vague to where I can see storytellers finding a lot of really cool, unique ways to use this. But for those who just kind of want to know be told what to do, they give some interesting examples. For example, the danger level can affect like how many bodyguards. Whatever the danger level is, that's how many additional guards this quarry might have. Or you can use that as a bonus to their damage or their certain rolls, the difficulty rolls to track them. How dangerous a situation is will make those things harder. Or maybe, the storyteller can let it be known, or just know, like, okay, once we hit danger 4 or 5, this quarry will be aware they're being hunted. They're going to start going after you or your touchstones. So there's just different things as a danger level. Again, it can rise by failing on desperation dice, or it can just rise for story reasons. Just to kind of let everyone know, okay, this is how bad things are getting, and means we should probably get this hunt taken care of as soon as possible before we're being hunted or our loved ones. What I like about this is that it is shared by the cell. It's a great way to mechanically support the idea that all the characters are in this together. You share your successes and failures, so teamwork is key. It also allows for really dramatic consequences of an action or role that affects the whole group. If someone messes up on their desperation roll and they raise the danger, again, it's not like vampire. We're like, oh no, that vampire's hunger level's up. It's no. Now the whole cell deals with a worse danger level and the consequences that come with that. I really like that because, again, this is a game of teamwork more so than vampire. If we're comparing it to that, to where what you do matters and what you do affects all of the other players. There's tension in that. There's a reason to root for and help the other players. I just really like what that adds. That it's sort of this thing that the whole group shares. That you can see the tension rising. You see the desperation rising. You could do efforts to make that go down, but that danger level is what you're really looking at too. And I just love the implications. Again, the lore implications, the mechanic implications of everyone's actions affect everyone. You make things worse, it's worse for us all. You do something good, helps everyone out too. So that's a really fun and I think kind of fitting mechanic that is in play with Hunter. Next, we're on to the layout and design of the book itself. Again, those of you familiar with Vampire, this was a common complaint I heard, layout issues. It's very difficult to navigate book. I will say right off the bat, this book is much improved in that. Still not as clean as some other TTRPG books, but they're getting there. What you can expect is that there's a mix of sort of vignettes, little snippets. One of my favorites, they have like a little example of Am I the Asshole thread. All of these just have to do for different hunter perspectives or org perspectives or things like that. They're just little introductions into the setting and the world, and sort of they can be inspirational or just to get you in the mood or to spark some ideas. I like these, but there is a lot less of them than in the vampire books, which I also think is appropriate. The vampire books were full of just these pages and pages of little first person perspectives or different lore and stuff like that, which is great. But there's less of that, which makes this book feel less cluttered. Where it's there, it's interesting, but I felt like they got a good balance of like these little peeks into the setting and the world, and then actually just giving us useful information about how to play the game. Going to the artwork, another hot topic for those who were familiar with Vampire. The artwork here is much more consistent. It's a consistent style. There's more of it, and it's artwork. It's drawn artwork. It's illustration, which I know a lot of people prefer. I like it a lot. It's simple, but it's kind of harkens back to the old sort of World of Darkness style, where it's kind of simple. I think it does a great job. It really gets the mood across. It displays some really cool scenes, really interesting characters that will inspire a lot. Especially the artwork they did for the antagonists and some of the creatures is just great. And there's still some really interesting sort of photography art with creative edits as well. Interesting side note, they even changed the cover after initially revealing it, getting some criticism from the community and changing it. Yeah, the one they have now I think is excellent. So yeah, that's as far as layout design, that's that. I'm going to go chapter by chapter and sort of read you the chapter headings so you can get an idea of what we have in this book. We have an introduction, of course, which is introduction to the lore and setting, some of the terms you can find in Hunter, and some of the game basics. Chapter 1 is called A Coming Reckoning. This explains the setting, this explains what hunters are, and explains the creeds, which we'll get into for the player section. Chapter 2 is titled Characters. It's character creation. It has the drives, the advantages, how XP works, and how a relationship map works to sort of connect your characters together, your cell together. Chapter 3 is Edges and Equipment, which is a list of the edges and the perks for those edges, as well as a list of weapons and gear, which every good hunter needs. Chapter 4 is Rules. This has the dice mechanics, the hunter-specific dice rules, and as well as just sort of general golden rule of gaming. Chapter 5 is Storytelling. This has some really excellent advice on running a game and just kind of storyteller advice in general, just good table etiquette and things like that. Chapter 6 is called Supernatural Threats. This gives antagonist formats and specific categories of the creatures, as well as specific examples of those creatures. This, think of it as sort of your monster manual, if you will, section, which is really well done. Something you have less of in some of the other books, but it's very necessary for a hunter game because it's all about what you're hunting, right? They do a really, really good job of this one. Great chapter. It takes us to chapter 7, Rival Organizations. Again, this is sort of your secondary antagonist, but I very impressed and surprised by how much thought and depth and just really cool lore they put into these hunter organizations. We get the lore in them, we get how they fit in the story, you get your different types of hunter organizations, as well as a bunch of specific examples of them and how they use them. And finally, there's an appendix, which has advice for considerate play, which is just general advice on how to play safely. This is a horror game that deals with some heavy stuff, and there's a lot of great things to consider when running a game like that for your table. My primary complaint here is it's still kind of spread out in terms of like, it would be nice if there's like the player section had the list of the drives, the edges, the redemptions for those drives, just all the things that I want to put on a character sheet. Would be nice if those in one section. You still have to do a little bit of flipping to like figure all those things out. Again, it's better organized than the Vampire Core book, I would say. But again, there's still a little flipping around here that would be nice if it was a little more condensed. Your little tabs or notes of what pages to look at stuff on is going to come in handy with this book, like other World of Darkness books. Now we'll get into what you can expect out of this book as a storyteller or game master, just if you're running the game. So there's lots of advice on just running the game itself, different themes of the game, different storytelling techniques, and a lot of lore that you can use. There's inspiration for crafting your own settings, stories, and what you're really going to get out of this as a storyteller is the antagonists. This is an excellent, excellent, excellent section. So again, I explained how organizations serve as secondary antagonists, and then we have the supernatural creatures or our primary threats that we're hunting. This introduces an antagonist format, which has sort of a list of monster abilities and weaknesses. So if you want to create your own creature, there's a list of like mechanics, like here's different abilities a creature could have. Here's different common weaknesses supernatural creatures have. You can mix and match them just to make your own thing, or just to kind of make ones that fit in these specific categories. Also has sort of general difficulty suggestions to do a really streamlined combat and encounters and things like that. If you want your players rolling against the difficulty of your creatures rather than you rolling against them for everything. This depends on your play style. The option is there. The different categories we have of creatures are vampires, werewolves, sorcerers and their creations, ghosts, and finally fair folk and stranger things. For those familiar with the other splats, sorcerers of creation is referring to mages most likely, ghosts, wraiths, fair folk and stranger things, changelings, the fae, things like that. Not only do they give you really good sort of general lore and inspiration for these categories of creature to make your own, they give really cool specific examples. This would be, as a storyteller, something that would be a good idea to hide from your players or ask them not to read this part, because it gives you just, again, this really interesting, fully fleshed out creatures, multiple examples for each of these categories that you can run a whole hunt, whole story focusing on. Not only talks about their lore and sort of their powers, and you get their actual stats, but also just, again, a lot of cool background information and how they might fit into a hunt and what they're weak. Like it's great. If you're a new storyteller to this, it's going to be much easier than in other splats to sort of pick a monster, build a hunt around that monster, and then just let your players go. It's much more forgiving and easier to access as a storyteller in this way. If you want to use the specific examples they provided some really cool examples for all sorts of different types of hunts. The rival organization. This was my most pleasant surprise in this whole book. Again, you think, yeah, this is Hunter the Reckoning. I want to fight monsters and like magic people and stuff like that. The organizations here are super interesting. They have information on, again, different categories of organizations. They break it down into academic, corporate, government, religious, and vigilantes. And then they have a lot of examples. I think around 11 different example organizations. Each of these fully fleshed out with like specific NPCs attached to it that you could just pull the names from, and you have everything to like what their mission is, what other people might think of them, what their goals are. There's so much to use here. Again, as a storyteller, this is such a gift, because World of Darkness games can be sort of overwhelming for the amount of things you need to know and make up yourself if you're used to like having a monster manual, things like that, to pull enemies out of or pull lore and NPCs out of and then build around that. You have that option with Hunter. Like I said, you have amazing organizations to use. That I originally, when I started kind of building my game before the book was even released and I had ideas, I wasn't thinking of rival organizations that much. And then once I had the book, I knew I had to include them because, again, they're good. They're good. This is one of my favorite chapters, and I'm really interested to see how it plays out with your cell hunting your creature and how these unique groups are going to affect that hunt. There's also a section with just a lot of quick stats for a lot of sort of common NPC antagonists you'll run into, like guards, animals, things like that. Overall, compared to Vampire, this is just a much more storyteller-friendly resource as a book that you can use to sort of actively build a whole chronicle around quickly if you wanted to, or steal some of the ideas from. I also like the implied pacing of this as a storyteller, because they talk about like sessions and then stories and then your chronicles, your whole thing, right? In Vampire, for example, it's less clear to define like what's a story. That's up to you, I guess, but that can like vary wildly storyteller to storyteller. In Hunter, your story is your hunt, really. Like when you kill the monster or encounter the monster and whatever happens as a result of that, that's your story. That's your mini arc. Again, your whole chronicle is multiple hunts. But it's really nice that as a storyteller, I don't need to build out this huge long campaign with all these things and figure out my end goal or all these like machinations. I just need to figure out what a cool hunt is. I need to find a cool monster and then build a mystery around that. Give them enough investigating to do to feel rewarded as they get information to use against my creature I'm throwing at them or my supernatural thing. Um, Very easy to do in this game, especially with all the resources they give you. It also makes XP easier to deal with because again, you can track like we hunted this monster. I want them to have roughly this much XP by the end of it. If you want to do milestone stuff, or just sort of track their progress with session by session XP. Next, we're going to get into what players are going to get out of this book, and I'm going to do a little more of a deep dive into what are hunters, because this is what you're going to be playing as. So I've talked about before, but again, a hunter is someone who is aware of the supernatural, and they need to hunt the supernatural. Something has happened that's awakened their drive to help them do so. A hunter is someone who believes they can do something about this threat, or at least they know they have to try. First thing you'll be picking as a hunter is probably your creed. Creed is the closest thing you're going to have to like a class or clan in this book. But it's a lot less restrictive than in other systems. Your creed typically just informs how you hunt, what kind of hunter you are. These are pretty vague and purposely so, because again, you can just come up with whatever idea you want. You could probably fit it into one of these creeds. And all creed really does is inform what your drive is. Which is what you'll use when you're doing something that connects with your drive. You can use desperation dice. Otherwise, like the skills you can have, the backgrounds you can have, the weapons, even your edges and perks, they have suggested ones for each creed, but none of it's restricted. Again, all it really is going to do is affect your drive, but it's also a great tool to get inspiration for the type of hunter you want to play if you sort of want to fit into one of these interesting archetypes. The 5 creeds in this book are entrepreneurial, which use bold innovations and experimental approaches. This is your DIY sort of, they use gadgets or hacker type stuff to sort of or gather information on the hunt. We have the faithful. The faithful operate with belief in higher powers, and they have a divinely informed worldview. There's lots of different religions that can affect how your hunter sees the world, and there are edges that lean a little bit supernatural that you can sort of flavor as faith-based. There's inquisitive. Inquisitive accumulate and employ knowledge against the occult, using both modern and ancient methods to study and learn about monsters. These are your primary investigators. They're sleuths, doing the digging or knowing where to research to find information. There's martial, which is martial. Hunters that rely on arms and tactics to combat the supernatural threat. These are the ones that are good at just straight fighting the monsters once you find them. Their drive reflects that. Finally, we have underground. Underground use guile, subterfuge, and knowing the right people to find their quarry. This is more of the socially leaning creed available to the hunters. And again, these come with suggested edges and drives, but nothing that you have to pick that's locked into certain creeds. The only thing is, well, your drive is set, and that just affects your desperation dice. All of these sections also have write-ups like personality traits, tactics, dangers their hunting style might face, all that you can use for inspiration when making your character. Again, these creeds aren't necessarily, they don't exist in game. Like if you're a vampire and you choose a clan, that clan is a thing that other vampires will know about. A clan exists. It's an entity. Faithful and martial and underground aren't like teams or titles that hunters have. That's more meta. It's for you as a player to sort of be informed on how you're leaning as a hunter. One hunter won't be like, oh, I'm an entrepreneurial hunter. What are you? That's not really how it is. This is sort of uniquely for the player, not the character. So as a player, you have that, and then you also have your edges and perks. These are sort of your powers, if you will, but these are purposely mundane, mostly, I should say. They're broken up into assets, aptitudes, and endowments. Assets represent tools, contacts, and other benefits that the average person is unlikely to have. Aptitudes are skills beyond what a normal person has, ranging from talents that require maybe like lifelong training to unique equipment or resources. Endowments are the closest thing a hunter is going to have to a superhuman ability. These abilities require a focus of some sort, usually. They're sort of minor abilities, but they specifically affect the supernatural. It's not going to give you like elemental powers, but powers to like repel or locate monsters. The edges and then each have perks. So like two people might have the same edge, but they can have different perks to sort of flavor them differently and have unique advantages or uses of them. You as a player are also going to want to figure out your cell. There's relationship maps. They brought this system over again, which I like a lot. And it's going to be useful because, again, you don't all want to necessarily be the same type of hunter or bring the same thing to a hunt. Everyone wants their thing, right? You want to be useful in a unique way. So that's something to keep in mind when building your cell together. Is like, all right, you're the tech guy, you're the gun guy. I mean, you can of course like have overlap and whatnot, but I think this is a opportunity to where not only to create unique characters, but sort of have your thing that makes you feel useful within your cell. There's also a cool section for players called finishing touches, and it's just a bunch of questions that are sort of specific to hunters that will really help you flesh out your character. I encourage you to use if you're struggling sort of building some depth. The only con sort of as a player is there's not a great deal of options here. Like it says, only the 5 creeds. There's really not a huge selection of like edges either. And some of the edges feel like they can sort of just be regular roles or sort of blur the line with some of the what could be just an advantage in like the flaws and merits section. It's certainly less like impressive than like the disciplines because obviously you're immortal. But that's on purpose. That's by design. So it'll take if you're expecting to come in and again create just this badass hunter with wild powers or abilities, and you're just gonna go slaying monsters. Dude, manage those expectations. Unless you work that out with your storyteller to play a game like that, that's not really supported rules as written in the mechanics because, again, a lot of these are you're mundane. You're a person. You're just a person who decided it's your problem to fight these incredibly dangerous threats. Again, there are some little bit of supernatural flair with the endowments, but nothing wild. And again, because of the limited choices, the longer a chronicle goes on, the chances for like overlap increase, I think. Unless you guys just everyone really leans into their specific thing. So while these can be discouraging, maybe, if you didn't have the right expectations, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm giving you, these expectations, so you know what to expect. But for the type of person, I love embracing the idea of like being an underdog and really having to like use my head and be smart and figure out the best way to approach my quarry, then this is the game for you. And that challenge is presented and reflected in the character creation process and the choices presented to you. Overall, that kind of covers everything you can expect to get from this book and the game as a whole. Personally, spoilers, I like this. I like this a lot. I really like the setting. I like that they took away the imbued and the divine Christian influence powers things, although I guess you could flavor as other things. That never felt super like Hunter to me. That felt like a flavoring of Mage, which Mage is my favorite, so there's nothing wrong with that. But I like that they stripped this down to you're immortal and good luck. That's exciting to me, and that leaves for some really interesting role play. I sort of like the desperation is not only a dice pool, it's a theme of this game, and I think the mechanics allow for you to really lean into that. Again, a game can't really be good or bad. It's just, does the game successfully do what it sets out to do? And I think this does. It sets out to do, again, an underdog story, a game of mortals desperately driven to take up this nearly impossible fight, and all the tension and drama and entertainment that comes with that struggle, with that story. If that's what they set out to do and they accomplished that with this book, absolutely. And if that sounds fun to you, I very much suggest picking this up. I think it will serve you well. But again, if you're expecting just like a combat heavy, I'm a hunter, I want to be like slaying hordes of werewolves and diving headfirst into vampire nests and stuff, it's not necessarily supported. It can be that game, but you're going to have to do a little bit of work as a storyteller to make it what you want, if that is what you want. Otherwise, so many options for storytellers as far as antagonists go, and a lot to just build really rich, interesting hunts. That's it for me. That's my review of Hunter the Reckoning, 5th edition. And if this still has you not sure if you want to pick the game up, we'll be playing a game. We are playing a game. It's probably already out now, depending on when you're watching. Watch us play and see if you like that. Again, I'm Bully. This has been my review. Happy hunting.